This is Revelation chapter 9, the sixth trumpet, part 3. I've already touched on this, but I will again come back to Revelation 9 verse 17, where it speaks of this army of horsemen and tells us that the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions. The symbolism used here echoes that which was used for the Saracen locusts of the previous trumpet, who were also noted for their ferocity, where it said they had teeth as the teeth of lions. We have previously noted that the first leader of the Turkish armies to cross the river Euphrates in AD 1063 was the second sultan of the Seljuk dynasty, Alp Arslan, and his name means the valiant or heroic lion. Later in AD 1097, at the time of the First Crusade, we read of the then Sultan Kilij Arslan, whose name means the sword of the lion or lion's sword. And we read a previous quote from Edward Gibbon, who said that this man was a lion in character as well as in name. In this slide on the left-hand side, we see a Turkish lira commemorating the 900th anniversary of the Battle of Malazgirt, which we talked about previously. In the book 1453, The Holy War for Constantinople and the Clash of Islam and the West by Roger Crowley, we read of the taking of Constantinople in 1453 by Mehmet II, and the scene being described here is that at the end of the siege. And Roger Crowley writes this: "The moment had come to escalate the conflict. Mehmet rode over to the Anatolian troops on his right flank, stationed just beyond the St. Romanus Gate. These men were heavy infantry, well equipped with chain armor, experienced, disciplined, and fired by a strong Muslim zeal for the cause." And we're seeing a re-emergence of this today with the terror attacks that have been carried out around the world by the followers of the Islamic faith, who are fired by this strong Muslim zeal, which causes them to act with lion-like courage. Anyway, Roger Crowley goes on. "They advanced down the edge of the valley, wheeled to face the stockade, and pressed forward in a tightly packed mass, calling out the name of Allah. With shouts and yells they came on." Said Niccolo Barbaro, quote, "like lions unchained against the walls," end quote. Roger Crowley continues, "The defenders were forced to duck beneath the stockade under the rain of arrows and other projectiles falling like snowflakes. At another signal the infantry advanced, quote, with a loud and terrifying war cry, 'Not like Turks but like lions,' end quote." Now, these quotes come from Niccolo Barbaro, who describes the lion-like qualities of the Turks, and this man was a Venetian surgeon who was in fact an eyewitness to the siege and who was able to escape by ship as the city was being taken. So this eyewitness to the fall of Constantinople uses the same imagery of the prophecy when he describes these Turks like lions, and this only further demonstrates the appropriateness of the symbolic language used in the prophecy. In this book titled Our Hind, The Slavic Kings and the Islamic Conquests, 11th to 13th centuries by Andrei Wink, the writer makes it clear that there are countless Muslim authors who are unanimous on the lion-like qualities of the Turks as one of their essential attributes. We read this: "Countless Muslim authors have left us graphic descriptions of what they consider the essential attributes of the Turks as an ethnic group and the reasons for the latter's preeminence in the Islamic world from the 11th century onwards. All authors of Adab works, manuals of war, and mirrors for princes agree on the military superiority of the Turks, their hardiness, their skill with horses and the bow and arrow, as well as their lion-like qualities and pride. Ultimately, the lion-like Turk, with his disdain for menial household tasks, was linked to the climate of his country of origin, which predisposed him to a certain robustness and military valor." Once again, we can see a strong link between the imagery used in the prophecy and its fulfillment in history, and this makes it easy to connect the two together. In the book called The Ghaznavid and Seljuk Turks, Poetry as a Source for Iranian History by G.E. Tetley, the writer quotes from a famous 11th century Persian court poet called Mauzi, who wrote in praise of the Turks, who were the ethnic group to which his patrons belonged. And he said this: they, the Turks, are like pheasants when they hold the wine cup, they are like lions when they hold the spear. In battle they burn more fiercely than the fires of hell. They are fitter for the Majlis than the houris of paradise. This poet, who knew his patrons, compares the Turks not only to lions, but also says that in battle they burn more fiercely than the fires of hell. And this also fits the description with the prophecy which says the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire, smoke, and brimstone, which is generally associated with hell. Now, I am going to go on and say much more about this fire, smoke, and brimstone, but for now we can see how well the imagery used in the prophecy fits with the descriptions given by those who knew these people well. This book continues and says, the poet continues in this vein at considerable length. The poem is very repetitive. Turks are compared with lions at least 4 times. The lion is the right image used in the prophecy, and this is verified in the language used in writer after writer who knew these people. Now, I think it's important to add that the fact that any poet or historian refers to the Turks as lions does not, in and of itself, prove the fulfillment of this prophecy. But what it does show, what it does establish, is that the use of the lion as a symbol in the prophecy is the correct symbolic use. It's not random in any way. And when we take this together with all the other aspects of the prophecy, the connection between this and its historical fulfillment becomes obvious. Here we have the opinion of the Chinese as it relates to the Turks from a book called Descriptive Ethnology Volume 1 by Robert Gordon Latham, and he records this. The opinions of the Chinese as to the relations with the rest of the world are collected from the following continuation of Masoudi's account. Now, this man Masoudi was an Arab historian and traveller who lived 893 to 956 AD and was known as the Herodotus of the Arabs. He was the first Arab to combine history and scientific geography in a large-scale work called, in English, The Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems, A World History. And Masoudi said this, quote, after ourselves follows the king of the lions. This is the king of the Turks, our neighbour. They are men lions. Next to them ranks the king of the elephant, that is to say, the king of India. The quote continues, then follows the Byzantine king, whom we call the king of men, for no men of earth have better constitution or finer countenances than the Byzantines, end quote. So here we can see the Chinese referred to the Byzantines as men, the Indians were identified with the elephant, and the Turks with the lion. The next aspect of this prophecy I'm going to take a look at now is in connection with this army of horsemen that had the heads of lions, and where it says in verse 17, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. And in verse 18, by these was the third part of men killed, by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths. What does this relate to? Well, it's a major historical feature of this era that artillery had not long been invented, and then the world's first concerted artillery barrage exploded to life at the hands of these Turks against the city of Constantinople. And so by fire, smoke, and brimstone, they were able to bring to an end, or to kill, as the prophecy states, the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire. And this is a truly amazing aspect of this prophecy, so let's look at the details surrounding this. Once again, let's remind ourselves of the barriers that existed for the taking of Constantinople. Constantinople occupied an extremely strategic position on the meeting point of Europe and Asia, as shown here. It was situated on a triangular horn of land called the Golden Horn, as shown, and this is at the mouth of the Bosphorus, the strait between the Black Sea in the north and the Sea of Marmara in the south. This meant that it was protected by water on two sides. In relation to the Sea of Marmara, to get to this you have to pass through the Dardanelles, which is another strait which opens onto the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. Now, on the land side of things, Constantinople had massive walls going back to the time of Theodosius in the 5th century, and some of these fortifications are still in existence today, such as can be seen here in this picture. And what we see here is a section of the original land wall which has been partially restored. The smaller front wall had a large moat in front of it. Beyond that, there was a second wall with towers, and then a more massive third wall with its own towers. And clearly the city had tremendous fortifications which could not be easily overcome. However, when the fullness of time had come, when the point of the prophecy had been reached under the sixth trumpet, which saw these myriads of Turkish horsemen come forth, and they didn't just come forth with horses only, they came also with fire, smoke, and brimstone, massive cannons or bombards as they were called, and they were deployed against these walls with devastating effect. Here we see a diagram of a cross-section of these land walls, and from this we can get a real appreciation for the truly massive nature of this construction. There was first the moat, then the first wall, then the second outer wall with towers, and then the third and largest inner wall with towers. Each successive layer was taller and thicker than the one before it. Here we can see the approximate measurements of this structure. The fosse or moat was about 60 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Then there was the low crenulated wall as shown, and then a space of 40 to 60 feet across to the outer wall, which was about 26 feet high and had 90 towers spaced along its 3.5-mile length. Then there was another 50-foot space to the inner wall, which was about 40 foot high and had 96 towers along its length, and these towers were about 60 feet high. Any attack from the land wall side of Constantinople meant having to deal with fortifications that were, including the thickness of the walls, about 200 feet wide, and which also stretched a length of 3.5 miles, so truly formidable fortifications. Here we can see a reconstruction of the city of Constantinople in the year 1200 AD. Now, not only was the city strategically very well placed, and not only were there these massive walls on the land side, and not only was the city surrounded by the sea, but also the city was entirely surrounded by walls, including on the sea side of things as shown in this slide, and yet there was still more. There was also a massive chain in place across the north inlet side of the city as indicated in this slide, and the purpose of this chain was to stop ships from entering, and it did just that. Here we have a painting of Constantinople from the seaside, which shows the walls extending right around the city, and also on the right hand side we can see the chain that was in place. Now, having dealt with the various aspects of the fortification of the city, let's get back to the prophecy where it says, "Out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone, and by these three was the third part of men killed." In the following quote from Edward Gibbon, he comments about the events that led up to the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, and one of these was the discovery of gunpowder, which was instrumental in bringing about the end for that great city. And he says this: "The chemists of China or Europe had found, by casual or elaborate experiments, that a mixture of saltpeter, sulphur, and charcoal produces, with a spark of fire, a tremendous explosion. it was soon observed that if the expansive force were compressed in a strong tube, a ball of stone or iron might be expelled with irresistible and destructive velocity. The precise era of the invention and application of gunpowder is involved in doubtful traditions and equivocal language, yet we may clearly discern that it was known before the middle of the 14th century, and that before the end of the same, the use of artillery in battles and sieges by sea and land was familiar to the states of Germany, Italy, Spain, France, and England. So I want to be clear that it was not the Turks who were the first to put gunpowder to use in cannons, but they took this relatively new invention and upscaled it for the taking of Constantinople, as we will go on and see. Note that the prophecy refers to fire, smoke, and brimstone is the archaic term for sulfur, which Edward Gibbon mentions in his quote, and this is an essential ingredient in the making of gunpowder. And I know this practically speaking because I used to make gunpowder back when I was a young lad. And now we'll read again from Edward Gibbon concerning Muhammad II and the preparation of these cannons for the taking of Constantinople and the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. Edward Gibbon writes under the heading of Reign of Muhammad II, Extinction of Eastern Empire, Part 2. Among the implements of destruction, he studied with peculiar care the recent and tremendous discovery of the Latins, and his artillery surpassed whatever had yet appeared in the world. A founder of cannon, a Dane or Hungarian, who had been almost starved in the Greek service, deserted to the Moslems, and was liberally entertained by the Turkish Sultan. Muhammad was satisfied with the answer to his first question, which he eagerly pressed on the artist. Quote, "Am I able to cast a cannon capable of throwing a ball or stone of sufficient size to batter the walls of Constantinople? I am not ignorant of their strength, but were they more solid than those of Babylon, I could oppose an engine of superior power. The position and management of that engine must be left to your engineers." End quote. On this assurance, a foundry was established at Adrianople. The metal was prepared, and at the end of 3 months, Urban produced a piece of brass ordnance of stupendous and almost incredible magnitude. A measure of 12 palms is assigned to the bore, and the stone bullet weighed above 600 pounds. A vacant place before the new palace was chosen for the first experiment, but to prevent the sudden and mischievous effects of astonishment and fear, a proclamation was issued that the cannon would be discharged the ensuing day. The explosion was felt or heard in a circuit of 100 furlongs. The ball, by the force of gunpowder, was driven above a mile, and on the spot where it fell, it buried itself a fathom deep in the ground. For the conveyance of this destructive engine, a frame or carriage of 30 wagons was linked together and drawn along by a team of 60 oxen. 200 men on both sides were stationed to poise and support the rolling weight. 250 workmen marched before to smooth the way and repair the bridges, and near 2 months were employed in a laborious journey of 150 miles. And so from the historical record, we can get a real appreciation for the resources and effort that was ploughed into this whole scheme, not only in relation to the construction of these massive bombards, but also their delivery to the end point. No expense was spared and no obstacle was too big to overcome. Here is an example of one of the Turkish bombards or cannons that were forged for the taking of Constantinople, and some of these can still be seen today in Istanbul, which is the modern name of Constantinople. If you're a tourist and you go there, it'd be exciting to go and see one of these things in the flesh, or I should say in bronze in this case. In this slide we can see a cross-section, a diagram of these enormous Turkish bombards, and you can see that the larger ones were comprised of 2 parts, which were then screwed together. Here we see the Dardanelles gun, which was cast in 1464, and this was based on the bombard that was used by the Ottomans for the siege of Constantinople in 1453. It's quite obvious that some of these cannons were truly massive, like the world had never seen. A man could crawl into the barrel of one of these. And you can also see the two parts of this cannon which were screwed together as shown in the previous slide. And once again, you can imagine the terror of seeing these things brought near to the walls of your city and then fired. It must have been truly awesome and terrifying. Here we can see an artist's impression of the siege of Constantinople, with the massive bombards being deployed against the landside wall of the well-defended city, but it could not withstand this newly developed weaponry. Again we read from Edward Gibbon, "The great cannon of Mohammed has been separately noticed an important and visible object in the history of the times." Note carefully what Edward Gibbon is saying. This was an important and visible object in the history of the time, and then consider the prophecy. The prophecy in Revelation 9 verse 17 and 18 actually draws our attention to this aspect by 3 times mentioning fire, smoke, and brimstone. And then we note from the historian that this was in fact an important and visible object in the history of the times. Once again, we have the right people in the right place at the right time. We have a more sure word of prophecy. Praise the Lord. Edward Gibbon continues, "But that enormous engine was flanked by 2 fellows almost of equal magnitude. The long order of the Turkish artillery was pointed against the walls. 14 batteries thundered at once on the most accessible places, and of one of these it is ambiguously expressed that it was mounted with 130 guns, or that it discharged 130 bullets." In the book Constantinople, the Last Great Siege, 1453, Roger Crowley writes, "On 12th April, lighted tapers were put to the touch holes of the Sultan's guns along a 4-mile sector, and the world's first concerted artillery bombardment exploded into life. If there is any single moment in the history of warfare at which an authentic sense of awe at the exponential power of gunpowder could be palpably felt, it is here in the accounts of the firing of the great guns in the spring of 1453. The taper ignited the powder, and when it had caught fire, faster than you can say it, there was first a terrifying roar and a violent shaking of the ground beneath and for a great distance around, and a din such as has never been heard. Then, with a monstrous thundering and an awful explosion and a flame that illuminated everything round about and scorched it, the wooden wad was forced out by the hot blast of dry air and propelled the stone ball powerfully out. Projected with incredible force and power, the stone struck the wall, which it immediately shook and demolished. And it was shattered into many fragments, and the pieces were hurled everywhere, dealing death to those standing nearby. When the huge stone ball struck the walls at an advantageous spot, the effects were devastating. The walls of Theodosius, the product of 2 millennia of defensive evolution, crumbled wherever it was hit. The defenders were amazed and horrified by what they saw." The psychological effects of the artillery bombardment on the defenders were even more severe than its material consequences. The noise and vibration of the mass guns, the clouds of smoke, the shattering impact of stone on stone dismayed seasoned defenders. To the civilian population, it seemed a glimpse of the coming apocalypse. It sounded, according to one Ottoman chronicler, like the awful resurrection blast. And with that, we'll end part 3 and move on to part 4.